If I were to show you this logo, what's the first thing that comes to mind? That is not surprising. Halo was the game that made Bungie a household name. It's one of the most influential console shooters ever made, is often cited as one of the main reasons for the Xbox brand succeeding, and was also a pretty great game and series to boot. The other likely candidate is Bungie's newest franchise, Destiny. Both the original and its sequel had massive hype behind them, and deliver solid core gameplay. I personally found both pretty disappointing in their own ways, but Destiny is certainly a big deal to some people, and therefore is likely to pop into their head. And maybe one or two of you retro traditionalists thought of Marathon. Hippies.
But what about me? What do I think of whenever the influential studio is brought up in conversation? Well, Halo. I think of Halo. I never claimed to be original. I mean, have you seen my videos? But the same year we got introduced to Master Chief and Friends, Bungie put out another game. And unlike everything else I've mentioned up to this point, it wasn't a first-person shooter.
Oni was released in January of 2001, 10 whole months before we all blasted our way across a ring-shaped world. Unlike the developer's most well-known franchises, Oni is a third-person action game, and while it does have guns in it, the primary focus of the gameplay is hand-to-hand combat. It was met with lukewarm reception from critics at the time, but did manage to garner a bit of a cult following over the years. Before now, I had never played it, but it did catch my eye whenever I was reminded of its existence. I mean, among Bungie's catalog, it undeniably stands out. The influences, the combat, the camera perspective, none of it conforms to the norms you'd expect from the studio. It randomly popped into my head again recently, so I finally decided to give the game a run through myself to see how it was and if it held up. I played the PC version, although there was also a port for PS2. Unfortunately, Oni never got put on any digital stores with all the included updates and patches to make it run on modern hardware, so trying to launch it vanilla won't really get you anywhere. But thankfully, there's an easy solution. Like many a cult hit, this game has a very dedicated fan following, and thanks to them, we have the Anniversary Edition patcher. This lets you not only play the game proper, but also allows for widescreen support, fixes some bugs, and lets you easily install a number of community mods. If you're playing with a monitor that has a high refresh rate, there's also one additional patch needed to fix associated control issues, but either way, after just a few minutes, this thing is up and running perfectly. Thanks for your hard work, Oni fanatics! When you boot up the game, you're greeted with a short introductory cutscene. If the cover art I showed earlier didn't make it clear what medium Oni takes inspiration from, then this certainly should.
It's like one of my Japanese animes.
Yes, this game takes its cues from anime, with landmark films Ghost in the Shell and Akira cited as the main influences. Neither of which I've, actually seen. No, it's not because I have some bias against the animus. I haven't watched a ton, but there's absolutely Eastern animation I've consumed and very much enjoyed. Full Metal Alchemist, specifically the Brotherhood series, Detective Conan, or Case Closed as it's known in the West, Trigun, Fruits Basket. The point is, I'm more than capable of liking this stuff, and since I can already see the comments yelling at me for having not seen either of these juggernauts, I guess I'll go do that real quick. Be right back. They're okay. I'm sure they were both mind-blowing when they were new, but neither really did anything for me. I actually found them both kind of boring. I'm gonna get comments about that now, aren't I? Anyway, Oni. The game is set in a dystopian future where Earth is so ravaged with pollution that little of it remains habitable by humans. Our polygonal purple-haired anime waifu protagonist for this adventure is Kanoko, an agent for the government's Technological Crimes Task Force, or TCF for short. Kanoko is highly trained, displaying exceptional martial arts skills, remarkable strength and speed, and has a strong desire to prove herself to her employers, specifically her commander Griffin, or as I like to call him, the original Captain Key Senpai.
You aren't really in a position to criticize.
She's tasked with investigating and taking down a terrorist group known as the Syndicate, who's led by this polygonal purple-haired anime dude who also has extensive martial arts skills and remarkable strength and speed, and if you've ever seen a work of fiction, you can probably infer some things about the plot already. But I'll leave the spoilers for later. For now, gameplay. Kanoko is one agile chick. She can run, she can jump, she can slide, and perform dodge moves both on the ground and while in the air. She can also crouch to move silently, which might give off the impression that the game has a stealth component, but enemies tend to notice you before you can close the gap on them anyway, so it's not really viable or advised. At best, you might get the drop on a guy every once in a blue moon. The opening tutorial does a good job of explaining all the control basics, including introducing you to the fighting mechanics. The primary way you'll interact with enemies and how they'll interact with you is through fisticuffs. Sure, some guys will bring guns to a street fight, but for the most part, everybody is kung fu fighting. Konoko can punch and kick, which you can naturally string together into a couple basic combos, and if she's close enough to an opponent, she can perform various throws. That's all the game teaches you up front as far as offensive melee options go. In fact, once you're thrown into the first mission, which has Konoko investigating a warehouse, you'd be forgiven for thinking that's all the combat has to it, since these simple attacks do get the job done against the grunts you're up against. That's what I assumed anyway, figuring I'd unlock additional combos and special strikes as the game went on. But then, while still on the first level, something happened.
Double spin kick!
Whoa, what was that? The game didn't teach me that. I can do that? How did I do that? Well, once I took the investigative initiative and checked the in-game diary, I found a complete move list detailing exactly how to perform a variety of ass-kicking maneuvers. I'm not sure if this is how it was in the original release, or if the Anniversary Edition removed progression barriers, but the version I'm playing has everything unlocked from the get-go. You just have to learn how to do the moves and experiment to see what works. This is undeniably cool, and you can't help but be excited to try out this newly discovered Melee toy box, but the downside is that not all moves are created equal. They all look neat with smooth animations, but a decent chunk of the attacks are either less effective than you'd want, or aren't worth the effort to pull off, requiring very specific timing or positioning that can leave you vulnerable in the middle of a chaotic brawl. Special moves like Rising Fury or the Devil's Spin Kick were pretty easy to get the hang of, and came with the added bonus of Konoko yelling their names out as she performs them, 'cause anime.
Rising Fury! Rising Fury!
But others, like this nifty Crescent Moon Kick or this Twister Kick, are moves I could pull off correctly a couple times while practicing in safety, but once you add in outside variables, like people punching me in the face, I just couldn't pull them off when I needed to, or see a reason to use them when there are better, more reliable ways to fight back. Even throws, one of the things the game teaches you up front, seem to happen more times on accident than because of intentional input, since they require getting up in an opponent's face and hitting forward plus kick or punch at the same time, which is harder than it sounds when things are busy. Then there are the disarms for gun-toting adversaries, which look neat, but then you realize that simply knocking these guys down with a running strike accomplishes the same thing without the long animation, so there isn't much reason to use them either. Of course, this is just my experience, and you might very well find some of the moves I dismissed more useful than I did. I'm not an expert after all, I just pretend to be one on the internet. But Craig, I hear you asking, what about defense? Well, aside from the aforementioned dodging, you're capable of blocking your opponent's blows from the front, but it's not exactly reliable. Blocking isn't tied to a specific input, happening automatically as long as Konoko isn't moving or attacking. That seems simple enough, but not only are you likely to be doing one, if not both of these things most of the time, enemies can still hit you from other directions, and tougher foes are smart enough to perform unblockable grabs or blows, making standing still a vulnerable position to be in. In Oni, the best defense really is a good offense. And boy is offense fun, especially in the game's first half where enemies are on the weaker side. You really do feel like a badass when you charge headlong into a group of grunts, use momentum to twist the first guy's neck, start pummeling on the second, and then spin kick to clear out anyone surrounding you. When Oni clicks, it really clicks, and is some good entertaining fun. However, as the game goes on, these moments of empowering ass-kickery do become less and less frequent as opposition gets stronger and more aggressive, making things considerably more difficult. Yes, challenge should ramp up as a game goes on. I'm not arguing that alone is a bad thing. But in Oni's case, the fights shift from being mostly fun with occasional annoyances to occasionally fun with regular annoyances. You're usually fighting multiple bad guys at once, which is fine at first when everyone goes down in a few hits, but at a certain point, you're taking on groups of baddies that all have a lot of health, hit hard, tend to spam special moves, and like to constantly block the majority of your shots. There are also times where they seem to blatantly cheat, interrupting your attack animations mid-stride to jarringly pull you into a grab, which feels cheap every time it happens. You can overcome these battles through persistence, and there are usually still some peons around to take out your frustration on, but a good amount of scuffles eventually feel like brick walls you have to bash your head against, rather than exciting martial arts throwdowns. But whether it's the empowering brawls or the frustrating beatdowns, I found a certain element missing from most of the game. It took me a while to realize what exactly that element was, but once I did, it stuck out like a sore thumb. Here's a random clip of a typical fight. See if you can figure out what's missing. Did you notice it? Probably not. Here's another clip.
Blockbuster!
Okay, maybe you need a contrast to know what I'm talking about. Here's one last clip, but this time, there's something added. Yeah, music. Most of Oni is lacking music. That's not to say there isn't any, because there are tracks that play at certain points, usually after some scripted event. The cyberpunk-themed electronic beats fit the game's style, and when paired with the flashy moves and fast-paced action, the excitement factor is significantly ramped up. But just as quickly as these songs appear, they fade out into the background after a couple minutes, once again leaving you in the silent void of punches, kicks, grunts, and the clickety-clacks of our heroine's footsteps. More liberal use of the soundtrack would have benefited the action immensely. If you're having trouble beating guys to a pulp, you could always try picking up a gun and shooting all the mean woman-hitting jerks. There are a total of 10 weapons in Oni, and despite what the front of the game box shows, Konoko can only carry one on her person at a time. Actually, come to think of it, none of the guns featured on the front cover are in the game either. There's no hand cannon, no LMG, and no shotgun. This is the E3 reveal trailer of box art. You'll acquire most of your lethal hardware from disarming enemies, though you can find an occasional piece tucked away in some back room if you explore a bit. They can get you out of a bind if the whole punching and kicking thing isn't quite working out, but don't think you'll be able to lean on them. Not only is ammo generally in short supply, but most of these armaments aren't all that fun to use. They don't produce very gratifying feedback and lack appropriate oomph, with even low-level guards requiring half a magazine for most guns to take out. Generally, their purpose is to soften up tougher targets before you go in for the hand-to-hand takedown. There are exceptions though, with two weapons in particular I actively sought out. First is this taser pistol that will stun enemies for a few seconds, leaving them vulnerable to strikes. Especially this devastating high-damage backbreaker move that you're rarely able to use in normal encounters. It'll even chain to multiple opponents if you're close enough, so it's a pretty handy little stun gun. Second is the Mercury Bow, essentially a sniper railgun that is undoubtedly the most powerful weapon in the game. It's capable of one-shotting any standard enemy and will severely damage harder opponents, making them easy to finish off. The trade-off to this stopping power is an extremely limited magazine holding only 2 rounds and a 5-second cooldown between each shot, but that's a small price to pay for the ability to instantly end someone's existence. Of course, this also makes it dangerous to go up against yourself, since there's usually some range between you and the bad guy wielding it, giving him a few chances to drain your health. Speaking of health, let's talk about the handful of items available to you. Most commonly, you'll come across hypos that work pretty much the same as painkillers from Max Payne in that they restore a chunk of health when used. That's pretty straightforward, but they also have an additional benefit if used when close to or at full health. Doing so will trigger an overpower effect, represented by an aura surrounding Konoko that temporarily increases the strength of her moves. The power difference is definitely felt, but it doesn't last very long, so I found myself largely ignoring this temporary advantage, choosing to save hypos for when I really needed them. There are also cloak and force field power-ups, though one is far more useful than the other. Becoming invisible might make enemies slower to react to your presence, but since you don't find many cloaks throughout the campaign and stealth isn't really a thing, its inclusion is overall pointless. The force field, on the other hand, is a big help, absorbing all projectile damage that comes your way, letting you close the gap to armed baddies with far less risk. It can be an invaluable asset, especially if a shot from something like a Mercury Bow catches you off guard, and they're provided just often enough to be useful without becoming a crutch. I haven't brought up level design yet, but that's because there isn't much that stands out about it. You probably wouldn't be able to tell where Oni gets its inspiration from based on these places alone. Each level serves its purpose as an expansive arena to beat up people in, but that's about it, without much to interact with other than consoles that are used to open doors. There are occasional brief platforming sections where you have to jump over gaps or dodge lasers, and an irresponsible lack of safety rails do mean you have to be careful when around ledges, as many tend to lead to a quick death. But otherwise, there's nothing really all that special about the world you're running around in. Alright, I'm going to talk about the plot in detail now. It's not exactly an original or surprising narrative, and knowing it ahead of time is unlikely to affect your enjoyment of the game, but just in case, go ahead to this timestamp on screen if you're sensitive to spoilers. So Konoko is fighting back against the Syndicate and their terrorist agenda. However, it's clear from the very start that her higher-ups are keeping a close eye on her, and seem hesitant to let her find out about her past, even referring to her as a creature at one point.
I'm getting tired of listening to your self-righteous tirades. Konoko is as much your creature as she is mine.
After trying circumstances cause her to defy orders, she learns that her real name is Mai Hasegawa, and that she has something inside her called a chrysalis. Deciding that she's become uncontrollable, the TCTF label her as a traitor, and she's forced to go rogue, raiding one of their facilities to uncover who she really is. Konoko learns that her father, a brilliant scientist devastated by the loss of his love, vowed to figure out how to save the human race from the deadly pollution that had consumed most of the planet. He figured that the only course of action was for humanity to evolve and started experimenting with the chrysalis, an organism that grows and adapts with the body of its host, and was able to develop 2 prototypes based on the DNA of his children. Yes, I said children, because it turns out, shock gasp, that the current leader of the terrorists, Muro, is the brother of our leading lady. Once the Syndicate figured out what he was doing, they raided the lab, capturing him and his son, while his partner and brother-in-law, Kerr, this guy, fled with a young Konoko to the TCTF. Once they learned of the experiments, Griffin forced Kerr to implant the chrysalis prototype in her as insurance for any potential future threat the Syndicate posed. Most of this is revealed in an exposition dump from Kerr himself in the middle of Konoko raiding the TCTF prison lab. But suddenly a soldier charges into the room. So this is probably supposed to be a really moving and heartfelt sacrifice, but it's kinda rendered moot when I came into this room with a fully charged force field, which would have harmlessly absorbed that shot anyway. A for effort, at least! With this new information, Konoko goes to confront her former boss, Griffin. She beats up her former comrades, finds this hidey hole in the basement, and then you're given the choice to either execute him for all he's done, preventing him from later turning into one of the Flood, or let him live and walk away.
You gonna do a superhero landing? Wait for it! Superhero landing! Yeah, that's really hard on your knees.
Remember all those frustrations I mentioned when it came to dealing with late-game enemies? Yeah, this final level really piles them up. Snipers in towers you can't reach, large groups of hard-hitting damage sponges, it's a pain in the ass. Anyway, you discover that Muro's plan is to pump poison into the atmosphere using processors all over the world that normally filter the bad air into something breathable, effectively killing the entire population unless they come to him and willingly become chrysalis hosts. Realizing she can't reverse the process, Konoko instead triggers a self-destruct that blows up these centers, which stops the immediate threat, but also dooms a portion of the human race to death anyway, since the source of their clean air is destroyed. Now it's time to take down Muro. This final fight is different depending on whether or not you chose to spare Griffin. If you chose to let him live, he'll show up with a few agents and help you battle Muro and his flunkies. If you instead shot him in the face, Muro evolves into a hulking mutant because reasons. In this form, he's invulnerable for pretty long periods of time, and you have to wait for an opening to do any damage. So this climactic encounter ends up boiling down to a lot of circle strafing mixed with hit-and-run tactics. And then the game's over, as we're shown an animated ending of Konoko wandering through the destroying remnants of Earth, hoping her father's research will be enough to save humanity.
And that's Oni. It has its ups and its downs, but is a decently fun time overall. Depending on how much you struggle with the late game fights, it takes roughly 8 to 10 hours to finish the first time through, but you may be wondering, is there anything else to Oni? Any reason to pick it up and play it again after that initial run? And the answer is yes, actually. There are 2 additional pieces to the package that I think are worth discussing. Mods and cheat codes.
As mentioned earlier, the Anniversary Edition patcher comes with a number of fan mods ready to be installed and played. Since some mods conflict with others, you can't do a blanket install of everything, but it's really easy to manage what you want to add or remove, and there's quite a lot to mess around with. Naturally, with these being mods, the quality of the add-ons vary wildly. For example, the handful of custom levels I played were all just kinda bad. But being able to give Kanoko some new moves and greatly expand the game's arsenal with a bunch of new guns is pretty rad. You can even give our heroine the ability to crawl, which is helpful? There are also texture packs available for levels and character models if you want everything to look weirdly shiny, or you think Kanoko would look better with a nose straight from Tim Burton's Planet of the Apes. While easy access to mods is never a bad thing, I actually had a lot more fun with Oni's built-in cheat codes. You've got your standard invincibility code if you're tired of bashing your head against a tough fight, and when combined with immunity to any kind of stun, you can breeze through bad guys with ease. Of course, there's classic big head mode, which turns the game into a waking nightmare, and also makes it impossible to use guns because your head is so fucking big it actively obstructs your view of the aiming reticle. Mini-Me makes Kanoko pint-size, letting you play the Ant-Man game we never got. She's actually so small that she can't reach the computer consoles for opening doors, and for some reason I just find this hilarious. Adversely, you can also make her super big, which sounds great, but in reality you're actually so tall that most of your attacks end up sailing right over the heads of enemies. But by far, the coolest and most awesome cheat that Oni has is called Shapeshift. With this enabled, you can cycle through and play as every other character in the game at the press of a button. With some exceptions, this isn't a simple skin swap. Whether it's the various guard types you fought against during your journey, the cowering civilians you kept running past, or full-on bosses, you're able to play as all of them, and quite a number of these guys have fully programmed movesets. The rule of thumb is that if you saw someone use an attack against you during your playthrough, you're able to swap to that model and execute it yourself. This blew my mind. You almost never see stuff like this nowadays. I guarantee if Oni were released in the present-day market, they'd charge like $15 for this feature and probably more for additional character packs. Sure, not all of these characters are created equal. Some do in fact share Kanoko's move list, variants of specific enemy types will all do the same attacks, and some models don't have any attacks at all, like this giant pair of legs. But the simple fact that I could choose to replay the entire game as Muro if I wanted, or as one of the training droids from the tutorial, is undeniably awesome. And on top of that, there are mods that add even more skins and playable characters. Turn Kanoko into Lara Croft, beat people down as a Spartan from Halo, or bowl through bad guys as Rayman. Goddamn Rayman! I can't stress enough what a great addition this is, even if the game didn't quite know how to handle a giant mutant running around the first level. Given its unique feel and how much it stands out from the type of game we usually associate with Bungie, it's not hard to see why Oni has its cult classic status. It has its problems, like bland stages, some combat moves that are either a pain or not worth the effort to execute, and a shift in difficulty in the late game with frustrating opponents that hurt the title's flow. It definitely would have benefited from a sequel to flesh out its ideas and smooth out its issues, and while development on an Oni 2 was started by a different studio, the project was ultimately cancelled, leaving us with only the original. Oni is at least worth trying out. If you want to experience an action-packed martial arts masterpiece, go watch The Raid. But if you're into purple-haired anime girls that know how to kick ass and you can put up with some annoying crap here and there, this largely forgotten piece of history from the house that built Halo might just be right up your alley. It's definitely more exciting than Ghost in the Shell. That's right, I said it!